Just as the water gently touched her skin, baby Truc Lam suddenly stopped moving the way she used to. Her tiny legs pressed against the sides, her body unable to stretch freely anymore. Trieu Duong noticed it instantly. The basin that once felt safe had quietly become too small for her growing body. Without saying much, he made a decision. If the space couldn't protect her comfort, he would build one that could. That very moment, he stepped outside, ready to shape a new wooden bath tray with his own hands, wider, safer, and made just for her. But will it truly give her the comfort and safety she needs? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. The afternoon light quietly slipped through the wooden door, spreading a soft golden warmth across the small yard. Inside, everything felt still, except for the gentle splashing sound coming from the corner where Trieu Duong was bathing his daughter. Baby Truc Lam lay in the old plastic basin, her tiny legs moving more than before, her arms stretching, her body twisting slightly as if she was trying to explore the space around her. But something was different today. She had grown, not in a way that could be measured by numbers or marked on a chart, but in the small, unmistakable ways only a father could notice. The basin that once felt just right now seemed tight around her. Every time she kicked, her legs would brush against the curved sides. Every time she tried to stretch, her elbows had nowhere to go. Trieu Duong didn't say anything at first. He simply watched. His hands moved slowly, carefully pouring warm water over her, but his eyes stayed focused on her small movements. Truc Lam didn't cry. She didn't fuss, but there was a subtle hesitation in the way she moved, like her body wanted more space than it had. And that was enough. For a father, sometimes the smallest discomfort becomes the loudest signal. He gently lifted her up, wrapping her in a soft cloth, holding her close against his chest. Her damp hair rested against his shoulder as she calmed almost instantly, her tiny fingers curling into his shirt. "It's getting too small, isn't it?" he murmured softly, more to himself than to her. There was no urgency in his voice, only quiet understanding. He placed her down on a clean, padded mat nearby, making sure she was comfortable, making sure she could still see him. Truc Lam lay there, her eyes wide, following every movement her father made. Even at 4 months old, there was a quiet connection in her gaze, trust without question. Trieu Duong glanced once more at the old basin. It had served its purpose. It had been enough, until now. But enough was no longer enough. He stepped outside into the yard, where pieces of wood were stacked neatly against the wall. The air carried a faint scent of earth and sunlight. This was where he solved problems, not with words but with his hands. He crouched down, running his fingers along the surface of a thick piece of wood. Solid, wide, strong enough to shape into something new, something better. He didn't sketch. He didn't measure with tools. Instead, he measured with memory. The length of his daughter's body, the way she stretched her legs, the way her back curved when she lay down. Every detail replayed in his mind as if it had been quietly recorded. "This one will be enough for her," he said under his breath. Back inside, Truc Lam made a small sound, not quite a cry, just a soft call. He turned immediately. "I'm here," he replied gently, "always." He brought the piece of wood closer to the workspace just outside the door, positioning it where he could still keep her within sight. That distance, never too far, never out of view, was something he never compromised. He picked up his tools. The first strike was firm, controlled. A sharp, clean sound echoed through the quiet yard. Wood chips began to fall. Each movement was deliberate. He wasn't just cutting wood, he was shaping space. Space where his daughter could stretch freely, where her small body wouldn't feel restricted, where every movement would feel safe. He paused after a few strikes, glancing back inside. Truc Lam was watching. Her eyes followed him, curious, calm, as if she already knew that whatever he was doing, it was for her. That look alone was enough to steady his hands even more. He continued. The outer shape came first, wider than the old basin, longer to give her legs room to extend. Not too deep, just enough to hold water safely without making it difficult for him to support her. Then came the inside. This was where it mattered most. He slowed down. Every cut became softer, more careful. He began shaping a gentle curve along the center, a place where her back could rest naturally, not flat, not rigid, but slightly raised, just enough to support her spine the way his arm would. Because he knew one thing clearly: if the wood could hold her safely, even for a moment, his hands could rest easier. He stopped again, brushing away the wood dust, running his palm across the surface. Still rough, not yet. He reached for a smoothing tool, beginning to refine the edges. Long, steady motions, back and forth, over and over. Time passed quietly. The sun shifted. The light softened. Inside, Truc Lam had grown quieter. Her small body relaxed, her eyes still occasionally searching for him. And every time she looked, he was there. Not once did he turn his back fully on her. Not once did he lose awareness of her presence. Because this wasn't just about building something. It was about being there, even while working. He moved to the edges next, rounding them carefully. No sharp corners, no rough lines, nothing that could scratch her delicate skin. Then he focused on the base. A smooth surface wasn't enough. He knew that. Water made everything slippery, and her movements, small as they were becoming stronger each day. So he began carving shallow grooves across the bottom. Subtle lines, evenly spaced, not too deep. Just enough to create friction, just enough to keep her from sliding. Each groove was carved with patience, each line placed with intention. Not rushed, not guessed, chosen. He paused again, leaning back slightly, looking at what he had shaped so far. It was beginning to take form, not just a piece of wood anymore, but something made for her, something that understood her needs, even before she could express them. From inside, a soft coo echoed again. Trieu Duong stood immediately, stepping back in to check on her. He crouched beside her, adjusting the cloth gently, making sure she was warm. "I'm almost done," he whispered. Though she couldn't understand the words, she relaxed at the sound of his voice. That was enough. He stepped back outside once more, picking up where he left off. There was still more to do. But every step, every detail, every careful motion carried the same quiet purpose: to make sure that the next time she lay down in water, she wouldn't feel restricted. She wouldn't hesitate. She would be free to move. And above all, she would be safe. The light had begun to fade, turning the yard into a softer, quieter space. The sounds of the day slowly settled, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of Trieu Duong's work. Each movement of his hands remained careful, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed down just enough for him to get everything right. He lifted the wooden tray slightly, adjusting its position to catch the last of the daylight. The surface was smoother now, the shape clearer, but he wasn't satisfied yet. Not for her. He ran his palm slowly across the inside curve again, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He wasn't just feeling the wood, he was imagining her lying there, her small back resting against it, her head slightly tilted, her arms free to move. Would it be comfortable enough? Would it hold her gently? Would it keep her safe when she kicked, when she splashed, when she moved without knowing her own strength? Those questions didn't leave his mind. So he continued. He picked up a finer tool and began smoothing the surface once more, this time slower than before. Every inch mattered now. Every tiny imperfection had to disappear. He paid special attention to the curve that would support her back, refining it until it felt almost like the natural shape of a hand. Because in his mind, this tray wasn't replacing his arms, it was supporting them. He moved to the edges again, pressing lightly, testing every corner. Rounded, soft, no resistance, just the way it should be. Then he focused on the grooves at the base. He traced each line carefully, brushing away the remaining dust. The shallow ridges caught the light just enough to show their purpose. Quiet protection built into the surface. They didn't stand out, but they were there, ready to do their job when needed. He leaned back slightly, looking at the tray as a whole. For a brief moment, he said nothing. There was no pride in his expression, only a quiet sense of responsibility. He stood up and walked inside again. Truc Lam was awake. Her eyes found him immediately, as if she had been waiting. Her small hands moved slightly, her body shifting against the soft cloth beneath her. She made a soft sound, almost like a greeting. "I know," he said gently, kneeling beside her. His hand rested lightly near her, not touching yet, just close enough for her to feel his presence. "You've been patient." He carefully lifted her into his arms again. This time she settled even faster, her body naturally leaning into him, her head resting near his shoulder. The warmth between them was quiet, steady, familiar. He stepped back outside, carrying her with him. The wooden tray sat there, finished, simple, natural, made entirely by hand. He lowered himself slowly, holding her securely as he positioned the tray closer. For a moment, he didn't place her down right away. He just looked, comparing, measuring again, not with tools but with instinct. Then gently he lowered her onto the tray. Her body settled into the curved surface, and something changed immediately. Her legs moved, freely, no more brushing against tight edges, no more hesitation. Her arms stretched outward, her fingers opening and closing, as if she had discovered new space for the first time. Trieu Duong didn't move. He watched. Every small movement, every reaction, every sign. Her body relaxed. Her breathing stayed calm. She didn't flinch, didn't resist. Instead, she moved more. Curious, comfortable, safe. That was the answer. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Then carefully, he lifted her back up again and placed her on the mat. This time there was a slight softness in his eyes. Not relief, not pride, but something quieter. A father's confirmation. He brought the tray closer to the water area, preparing it for use. He poured warm water slowly into it, watching how it settled, how it spread across the surface, how it interacted with the grooves he had carved. No slipping, no uneven flow, just calm, steady water. He tested it with his hand, warm, comfortable, just right. He turned back to Truc Lam. "It's ready," he said softly. He lifted her once more, holding her close for a brief second before lowering her gently into the water. This time was different. Her body rested naturally against the curved support. The water reached her just enough, not too deep, not too shallow. Her legs began to move again, but now there was no interruption, no restriction, just movement. Free, small kicks, tiny splashes. Her arms lifted slightly, her fingers touching the water, creating soft ripples that spread across the surface. And for the first time that day, she looked completely at ease. Trieu Duong kept one hand near her, steady, ready, never leaving her side. But he didn't need to hold her the same way as before. The tray supported her gently, allowing him to focus on guiding, not controlling. That difference mattered, because safety wasn't just about holding on, it was about creating a space where she could move without fear. He poured water slowly over her, his movements even more gentle now. The light from outside reflected softly on the water surface, flickering across her face. She blinked, then relaxed again. A small sound escaped her, not a cry, not discomfort, but something closer to contentment. Trieu Duong's expression softened. "There you go," he whispered. His voice was low, steady, almost blending into the quiet surroundings. Each moment stretched gently, without urgency. The world outside didn't matter here. There was no rush, no distraction, no noise loud enough to break this small, protected space. Just a father and his daughter, and the quiet care that connected them. He adjusted her slightly, making sure her head stayed in the safest position, his hand always ready beneath the surface, just in case. Always there, even when she didn't need it, especially when she didn't notice, because that was his role, not just to respond, but to protect before anything could happen. The water moved softly around her, guided by her small kicks. The grooves at the base did their job quietly, keeping her from slipping, keeping every movement stable. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible to anyone else, but everything important. Time passed without being counted. Eventually her movement slowed. Her body relaxed more deeply. Her eyes grew softer. Trieu Duong knew it was enough. He lifted her gently from the water, wrapping her immediately in a warm, dry cloth. He held her close again, one hand supporting her head, the other securing her small body. She settled into him without resistance, as if this was where she belonged. He dried her carefully, each motion slow, deliberate, never rough. He checked her skin, her arms, her legs, not out of worry, but out of habit. A quiet routine of care that had no shortcuts. When he finished, he held her just a little longer than necessary, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. Outside, the light had nearly disappeared. Inside, everything felt calm. The wooden tray sat nearby, still holding traces of water, quiet evidence of what had just happened. It wasn't just a new object. It was a solution, a response, a promise that as she grows, he will always be there to make space for her, to support her, to protect her, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, steady way he always has, and always will. As baby Truc Lam grows, her old bathing basin slowly becomes too small, limiting her movements and comfort. Trieu Duong notices the subtle change, the way she can no longer stretch freely, and quietly understands that she needs something better. Without hesitation, he decides to build a new wooden bath tray by hand, carefully shaping it to fit her tiny body. Every detail, from the gentle back support to the anti-slip grooves, is crafted with patience and love. Throughout the process, he never takes his eyes off her, always staying close. When the tray is finally complete, it gives Truc Lam the space and safety she needs, allowing her to move freely and feel at ease, surrounded by her father's quiet, unwavering care.